Quadratic equations are such a big topic in algebra that they get their own unit in this Algebra 1 course. But what are quadratic equations? Quadratic equations are those equations in which the highest power of x is a 2. And quadratic equations follow this format. A x squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are called coefficients, and they can be any number, positive or negative, even 0. As long as the equation highest exponent is x squared, well, it's 2, exponent of 2, and as long as we have an x squared, it's considered a quadratic equation. Let's view some examples of quadratic equations. 2x squared plus 5x plus 6, this is a quadratic equation. It follows the format, and the highest exponent of x is a 2. What if we change the numbers to negative numbers? It's still a quadratic equation. It doesn't matter if the coefficients are positive or negative. We can even get fractions. As long as it follows the format and the highest power of x is a 2, it's considered a quadratic equation. But if we have a combination of positives and negatives, it's still a quadratic equation. Now, something very important in this equation that we can see right now on the screen is the x squared is being multiplied times a 1. When we multiply an x squared on an x, or actually any variable, times 1, we never write the 1. We just put it blank because the 1 doesn't make a difference. So that's why we don't write it. And it's very important we remember this, not only through this unit, but also for the rest of algebra and math. Because a common mistake is, if you don't see a number next to an x, we say that the coefficient is 0. That's a very horrible mistake. If you do not see a number next to an x squared or an x or any variable, it is a 1. The coefficient is 1. Now let's proceed. This is still a quadratic equation. Then let's do some modifications. What if we get rid of the negative 14, the number without an x? It is still a quadratic equation because technically in this case, c is equal to 0. So yes, it's still a quadratic equation because the highest exponent of x is a 2. What if we bring back the number without the x, but we get rid of the number with the x? It is still a quadratic. In this case, b would be equal to 0. As long as we have the highest exponent of x equal to 2, it is a quadratic equation. Let's bring back our term with an x. What happens if we get rid of the x squared? Now this is no longer a quadratic. If you don't have an x squared, it is not a quadratic. You need an x squared to have a quadratic equation. So let's bring back our x squared so we can still call this a quadratic equation. Then what if we replace that negative 3x, we replace that x for a square root of x? This is also not a quadratic because quadratic equations are polynomials. We'll talk about polynomials in Algebra 2. And something very important about polynomials, all the exponents must be integers and must be positive. If we remember from the basic algebra course, the square root of x is x to the 1/2. That is not an integer. So let's get rid of our square root. Let's bring back the x. So this is again a quadratic. And let's analyze this quadratic we have here. Remember, it follows the format of ax squared plus bx plus c. Let's complete our quadratic on the top. Remember that x squared doesn't really have a number multiplying, so when we don't have a number written, that's a 1. So let's not forget that. It will be very important. And also, it is critical throughout this entire unit, we are capable of recognizing the coefficients of a quadratic equation, starting with the x squared. A is going to be any number that multiplies the x squared, positive or negative. So in this case, a equals 1 because we have 1 times x squared. If we would have negative 1 times x squared, then a equals negative 1. If we have 16 times x squared, then a equals 16. If we have 3 over 4 times x squared, then 3 over 4 equals a. The next coefficient we're looking at is the negative 3. And that means b equals negative 3 because b is the number multiplying the x. And it's very important we carry the negatives when we have them. Here we have negative 3, so that's why b equals negative 3. The coefficient is the number multiplying with its respective sign. In this case, b is any number with its sign multiplying the x without the square, so the x to the power of 1. That's why b equals -3 for this equation. And finally, we have the 6, which is related to the c because c is the number without any x. So in this case, c equals 6. If we wouldn't have a -6, then c equals -6. If we would have a -1/2, c equals -1/2. +1/2, c equals +1/2. Whichever number doesn't have an x, that is c. And these are the coefficients of our quadratic equation. Let's remind it one more time because it will be critical for many of the equations and procedures we're going to review in this unit. Understanding the coefficients of a quadratic equation.